From Wakefield, it's the Nolan Car Night Show. We're going to join Nolan and his guest this week, Mark Linett, back to the show. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's Nolan.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the show. And my oh my, do we have one of my top favorite guests returning back to the program? And I'll say this: the last time this guest came on, he got the most views out of any other interview I've done on this podcast. It was over 500, I believe. So to have him on again was a big treat for me. Last time he was on, we talked about the new edition of Sounds of Summer. Now he is on here to talk about at the time of this recording the newly released Sail on Sailor box set, which is about Holland and the Carnival Passions albums from the early to mid 70s. It's a pleasure to have this man on. Not only has he worked with the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson, the state of Jimi Hendrix, he's worked with several other successful artists as in charge of Your Place or Mine recording studios. He is the man himself, the Mark Linett. My friend, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks, Nolan. Nice to be here.
Of course, it's always a blessing. Again, as I said, thank you for helping me and being so kind to want to do this again. As you said before we got going here, you've been a busy man the last few years, but specifically, I'm sure the last chunk of time with this release and everything of that nature. I want to start like this. Last time we talked about COVID and how it's sort of been, so we don't have to go that route again. But for you, compared to Field Flows, what was different about this process in terms of the project's process for putting together and the end goal of it?
The biggest thing probably was putting together the complete Carnegie Hall show from
Yeah,
Thanksgiving of '72. We had two. They did. I can't believe this. I mean, they did two complete shows, four sets total at that concert. So editing that to one complete performance, which was of course the intention, was even after all the work I've done for the Beach Boys and on live material in general, that just turned out to be a much more complex, time-consuming project, part of the project that even I expected.
sure,
Yeah, part of that was it's hard to estimate that
sure.
that kind of thing until you really get into it.
Sure. Well, and to think that 50 years ago when they had that concert that they knew that it was going to be on a live album, so now to finally have it out and about is a pretty special thing.
Yeah, I mean that was the intention, was to use that for a live album, and for whatever reason, they didn't use any of it and wound up using recordings from the 3 4 days before in Passaic, New Jersey, and
Sure,
then some of the recordings from 1973. Um, Nothing. I mean, we've used bits and pieces of this concert over
sure.
the years, but it was not used on the in concert album.
Well, I'm curious about that because they had the 73 live in concert album that they had released with Dennis Wilson on the front cover where he's in front of all those fans. And then there's the other concerts. They released the Nebworth concert that came out on CD in the early 2000s, and they had this. And I was just curious about that. I mean, as we said, it took 50 years to come out. So for that, does that hold a lot of importance to you that you were able to help bring that into the limelight since it's such a historic thing for Beach Boy fans?
Yeah, I mean, this is the first time. Well, first of all, it's the first time we've ever released a complete front to back show. I mean, Nebworth isn't entirely complete. There are a few songs that we had to leave out for various reasons. So it's the first time that's ever happened. We've done a complete front to back show, and then of course, yes, the historic nature of them playing. I mean, they played Carnegie Hall several times
Sure.
in that period, but this is the only one that was properly recorded. Well, recorded at all for that matter, except by fans.
I mentioned, the high point of some of the stuff on this album, and similar to Field Flows, the Sail and Sailor era was another part of their creative high point and their music history. For you to be able to put that together and put that out there, was that another big accomplishment for you?
Yeah, both of these projects, Field Flows and Sail on Sailor, are projects that I've wanted to see done for many years, probably at least 20 years, and it's always been a bit of a challenge to get past the Capitol era because in part because the Beach Boys did change during this period, and are not quite the same group.
Sure.
I mean, musically, not the same group they were at Capitol in the '60s. To their credit, and so it's been always a bit of a challenge in some way. I'll just say marketing wise, to revisit this portion of their career. And I personally always expected, and I had some support, from the fans and internally, that if and when we were able to do this, that it would get a really good response, and
Sure.
that's been true. I mean, actually, it goes all the way back to 2017 when we did Sunshine Tomorrow, and I mixed Wild Honey in stereo, and we included a lot of stuff, outtakes from there and from Smiley Smile and track breakdowns and so forth, because that's when the Smiley Smile and Wild Honey is when the change in the marketplace really began. And so for a lot of people, they were really overlooked records, and it was a very favorable response. I mean, we were surprised, the label was surprised, that the sales were really good on that project, and that a lot of people appreciated all this music that they hadn't really been exposed to before.
Sure. Speaking of the historic Carnegie Hall concert, there's also a big time historical and Beach Boy nut release on here, being the Fairy Tale on here. And everyone knows the story of Brian, his take on it, and Jack Riley narrating it. Compared to the Carnegie Hall concert, what was that like, bringing the Fairy Tale out into the public?
It's just part of the whole album or albums that they released in that time frame. I mean, we have released, we did put various parts of the Fairy Tale on before, and it's been reissued. The biggest thing probably on this release is that on the vinyl editions, the 2-disc and I want to say 5-disc without looking it up, for the first time we've actually created a facsimile of the original 7-inch 33 1/3 two-sided single with the original artwork. Actually, the artwork, I haven't seen it yet, I don't have my copy, but I've read that they actually did it in heavy cardstock as opposed to the sort of picture sleeve, kind of inner sleeve, kind of printing that was done back in the day.
Sure.
So that's probably the biggest thing, is that we were able to do that, and then of course present something similar to what I think was on the '93 box, where we presented just the music, all spliced together, and then various bits and pieces, a cappella mixes, and and then a demo of Brian running it down.
Sure.
With Carl.
You mentioned sort of songs that are left off the original album that were still quality material that you're able to kind of bring back into the limelight and share with people on this box set. Sort of describe, if you can, the process of, because I find it interesting, there are songs on there, there's a few live songs not from the Carnegie concert, there's some demos on there, like the Robert Frost poem that Al is recording, or the demo that seems to turn into the All This Is That sort of. But for your process, and maybe Alan's as well, how do you go about choosing what stuff makes the cut in terms of the demos or the other live songs on that set?
Well, it always starts with what do we have? What do we, and in this case, a fair amount of material that we weren't entirely sure we could use because of who, first use release. I think there was one or two things that we had to get Blondie and or Ricky to sign off on, because they had never been really, the songs had never been recorded by anybody. And then things like the Sail on Sailor demo that we've known about for years. And I mean, that was always a lock. I mean, we've been we've known we could use that. Jonathan Anderle, David Anderle's son, let us know long ago that he had found his father's copy of that cassette, or the original. We don't know for sure, and that we'd be able to use it. But to finally do it was great. And then there was some other material that it took. Took some work, especially on Alan's part, with various people either giving us material or letting us use material that we had, but we couldn't just arbitrarily throw on a set like this. I mean, it's
Sure.
bootleggers have a certain advantage in that they don't
Yes.
have to worry about those kind of issues.
Sure. Well, it's an interesting concept, and I'm sure there's so much that you find or have found, seeing as you have that sort of bird's eye view and first person perspective. So it's, I'm sure, a challenge to figure out, okay, what do I put on here, what not to put on here. On other albums that have been there, like Field Flows and so forth, there are songs that they perform from different decades. Seeing as this is from the early 70s, how hard were you trying to find these other live recordings of these songs from this period to be from that period instead of, let's say, from the 80s or a different decade?
Oh, I mean, you have this problem where they're only going to be doing in the year where the records are released, or the year after, the tours after that. They're only going to be doing a certain number of the songs, and then they tend to last in the set, longer or shorter.
Sure.
I mean, Sail on Sailor, pretty much continues even to this day, I think. But that's why we went to some of the 73 recordings, for songs that they weren't, they weren't doing at Carnegie Hall.
Sure.
And they didn't, as far as I can remember of listening to some audience recordings, they weren't doing in 72. They didn't start doing them till 73. And we always try in these releases, when we have room, which is usually always, to find live versions of the songs on those albums, regardless of the year that they were performed.
Sure.
I mean, the only All This Is That was done during the 93
Yeah.
sort of unplugged tour, and that's why we went there. And they're just, well, depends on the project. I mean,
Sure.
previously we haven't been doing a whole concert, so we'll take a variety of live recordings from various generations. I think on Field Flows,
Sure.
we even had I think what song was it? I can't remember. I know it goes into Don't Worry Baby, but anyway, that we actually took from a 1982 show, because it was one of the few times that they were doing it. And obviously, well, I don't think nobody started doing their whole album until, that's a fairly recent phenomenon. Sure. So it can be, it can be interesting to try to find live performances, which are always, an interesting contrast.
Sure. And I'm sure it's fun to a certain degree. I'm sure picking what songs you want to take out and use. Last time we were on here in last June, when Sounds of Summer, the new issue, came out, we talked about your role and Alan's role and the Beach Boys' role of bringing this music to people who might not have heard it, or those who know it but haven't heard certain parts of it before. With a situation like Sail on Sail in the box set, maybe similar to Field Flows, it's not necessarily the greatest hits like a Sounds of Summer, where everyone knows necessarily the whole chunk of songs. So with a project like this, how do you find yourself trying to get this music out to an audience that may know some of it, but some who may not know it at all?
I mean, we just try to put together the best package of material. Obviously, the original albums speak for themselves, and then things to surround it with on the bigger volumes. I mean, the 6 CD, and of course it's all up on streaming as well. I've always been, and Alan always been, very fond of deconstructing their masters to some degree, to show the process. And not unfortunately, but this era we are now into 16 fully into 16 track recording, which is great because it means they can do a lot of other things, and the live recording there's much more track separation than we're used to. The only downside is that because two things, because tape was very getting very expensive at that point. Even hear Mike talk about it during the Carnegie show. They, unlike the 60s, where they would basically save everything. Maybe once in a while, if you ran to the end of the reel, maybe you'd go back and record over the first 10 or 15 takes. But at this point in time, it's much less likely, and you're also sort of recording with a basic, a very basic band track, fewer instruments initially, and planning to overdub. I mean, one thing we found is I found was in doing some transfers is that I was doing a transfer, I forget what song it was, and at the end there was a bunch of material that was backwards, which was which meant to me that they had run the tape, and rather than rewind it and record over it, they just ran to the end, turned it over, and recorded over what was there. And it turned out that it was the tracking for Here She Comes, and so we were able to use that on the box, where generally we don't have a lot of band outtakes. And you also tend to not have, because you're not recording from machine to machine anymore, you don't tend to have a lot of, generally, a lot of unused vocals. I mean, the whole thing about Sail on Sailor, for example, and there's talk that, Dennis tried to record it and Carl tried to do the lead vocal, but if you go to the multi-track, it's really interesting that it's full, but because there's only, I think, two background tracks and Blondie's lead vocal, there's no leftover, unrecorded, unused, lead vocals.
Sure.
And there, if then maybe there was a rough mix made, or
Sure.
Somebody took it home, but we don't have anything in the library. And that leads me to think, as an engineer, that it may be simply that they were all in the studio and Dennis tried to sing it, Carl tried to sing it, and then Blondie sang it, and that they were satisfied with that being the best, so they kept it.
Sure.
There are lots of reasons that could apply here, but
Sure.
The important thing is that Blondie's is the only lead vocal that we've ever found anywhere.
Sure. Well, that's
obviously everybody sang it live.
Yeah.
Not everybody, but
yeah, most.
And that's why we put the Billy Hinchy a version with Billy singing lead from '75. In part to honor him, since we lost him earlier this. I think it was in 2022 or late last year. I can't remember.
Yeah, I like that, and I like his. I also like the live versions that there are of Carl singing the song, especially near the end of his time on Earth, where it still shows that he still has that prominent voice that he had. I keep going back to this of where they were artistically at this moment with their music, and the following albums that pursue after these. And one of my favorites, if not one of my top favorite albums they do, is their self-titled 1985 album, where they go over in England with Steve Levine, who produces Culture Club and so on and so forth. Is there any album after these that you're most looking forward to sort of diving into next?
Well, I have no idea what might happen next, but I mean, Love You would be a record that it would certainly be interesting to explore. The other thing about the band at this point is that while they have come back into their own, and they expand their audience from here, and a couple of years later find themselves playing for hundreds of thousands of people, which is pretty interesting. After for a while there in the late '60s, they had a tough time drawing a decent sized audience. But you can hear the dichotomy on the live show because, and I've never fully understood this, although I experienced it. I mean, I bought, I'm 70 years old, so I started buying Beach Boys singles, around well, I heard them in 62. I don't know that I bought one until 63, but I bought them all. I bought all the big hits. I didn't buy any albums because you didn't buy albums then. Nobody bought rock and roll albums really until the Beatles, meet the Beatles. Then we started buying albums. But even then, the Beach Boys as an album band didn't really, work for me. And while I didn't think of them, as the late 60s came along, and we suddenly go into alternate format FM radio, and it's it is albums. It's the Jefferson Airplane and Hendrix and Cream and and the Beatles and all that. The Beach Boys, the hits were still there, nominally, but the albums, even Pet Sounds, I mean, I bought it, but it didn't make a big impact on me at the time, and it probably had to do as much both with their image, which was still a holdover from what they had been, and they weren't being played. I mean, Pet Sounds, Smiling Dove, even Sunflower, which a lot of people and critics agree was a fantastic album. I've heard stories that alternate FM DJs that said it was great, but they couldn't play it because it was the Beach Boys. So it wasn't until Surf's Up came along that suddenly they had a place in in the current music scene again, and which was great. The only, I won't say it's a problem, and I can't totally understand this, but you can hear it on the Carnegie Show that a lot of the audience is less interested in the new material and much more interested in hearing them play "Help Me, Rhonda" and so on and so forth. And then of course endless the hits albums that come out a few years later really cemented their reputation, not as an oldies band exactly, but that this younger audience really wanted to hear those songs. And I think while they certainly tried to create new music, I think it definitely had an effect on what they were doing, because the two things were a little incompatible. And you hear this, you hear this on all the shows. Also, when you've got 20 or 30 big recognizable hits, when you go to do a concert, how many new songs are you going to be able to include? It's a tricky thing. And something that I always talk about is, I mean, the amazing thing is that they did become so successful, in this period with both their new and their old music. If you'd asked me personally in, I don't know, 1967, where the Beach Boys fit into things, I think I would have said they were a little more relevant still to me than their contemporaries. I mean, Jan and Dean or Gary Lewis, but still, they fell into the striped shirts and I mean, when you're getting high and playing Jimi Hendrix records, it's a little, it's a little hard. But they're really the only group that I've ever been able to think of that managed to have both this amazing, career in the early mid 60s, and then come back, with the Surf's Up album and after that, and be even bigger, as an act, as a band. I can't think of anybody else that managed to pull off a trick like that.
Last time we also spoke, we talked about your working relationship with Brian, that you've been with him for the last few decades and a lot of his solo albums and so forth. looking at that and the stuff you've done with the Beach Boys as well, would you ever have interest if they gave you the opportunity or asked you to do like a box set of maybe some of Carl or Dennis's solo stuff, or are you just happy doing Beach Boy stuff?
No, I'd be thrilled to do that. I mean, I don't remember. I'd have to count up for you. I mean, I could do it on my hands, I guess. You know, Brian's solo records that I worked on, either from start to finish, or there are a few that I recorded but didn't mix. And I didn't do the last, I don't know, last couple. Although a bunch of stuff that I recorded in the '90s is on the Long Promised Road soundtrack.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, you know, something that I've and I don't know if we're ever going to do this, but something that I proposed a while ago, for the, well, just in general, but I would have liked to have seen it for the 60th anniversary, was a set that essentially featured each member of the group on a single disc.
Oh, wow.
More within the Beach Boys,
Sure.
than solo, but we certainly could have considered that if it had, you know, if it had been greenlit, to do a project like that. And maybe, you know, maybe we can get there at some point. You know,
Yeah.
the music business is kind of funny now because, you know, when I started doing these kind of projects, there were no budget constraints. There were no, I mean, you know, there was no worry about, you know, what's this going to sell. It was an art project. I mean,
Sure.
it's simple economics. I mean, you know, when Capitol Records was selling, you know, 10 million Bob Seger records, you know, a Beach Boys reissue, the consideration was not, what it was going to sell.
Sure.
And and they still sold very well, because of course that in those days, people, you bought it or you didn't. There was no, you know, there was no streaming, there was no downloads, there
Sure.
was no, you know, I mean, we had bootlegs, but you know, that was still buying.
Sure.
You know, so things have changed, you know, dramatically over the years in terms of these kind of projects, which on one level, you know, it is history and it's important, and you know, it would be nice if it wasn't an economic concern.
Sure.
And then on top of that, you have the problem of there's only so much room in the
Sure.
marketplace for physical product, and in terms of vinyl, everybody wants to do vinyl, and you know, there's only so much vinyl that can be pressed at any, you know, in any time period. And you know, so I mean, the lag time on that, you have to book it, and it's like 6 to 8 months at least. um so it's quite, you know, even something that's successful, to follow it up can be, you know, can have a lot of other considerations. And by the same token, you know, in terms of sales, I remember when we did the first version of Sounds of Summer, by then there were considerations. I mean, it wasn't so much the way it is now, where it really has to be mapped out.
Sure.
But there, you know, there was an expectation, given, you know, we've been doing a lot of other projects. They've had sound sessions and the other box sets and the two first. I remember, you know, talking to marketing, and there was an estimate of what they expected it to sell.
Sure.
And ironically, what they expected was 500,000, and of course initially it went on to do closer to 2 million,
Sure.
and now it's up over 4 million.
Yeah.
Which it's kind of, you know, it's kind of interesting. I mean, it does show you that to some degree you just never know.
Sure. Yeah.
As I said, I mean, I have it here actually. Let's see, will it let me, you know, oh, there, so, well, there
Yeah.
it is. Yeah. Sunshine Tomorrow, you know, I don't know what, well, I'm sure there was an expectation. There pretty much has to be.
Sure.
There has to be a number, a sales estimate attached to any release these days,
Yeah.
or you can't do it. I remember that they underestimated, and they actually had to
Oh, yeah.
hold the release up. And this is 5 years ago, but for a couple of weeks, so they could press up more vinyl, because
Okay.
the pre-order exceeded what they had expected.
Sure. Well, I'm sure it's just a great feeling. I'm sure for you to be part of that and to help at least try in your whatever degree you can to help bring that to fruition. I want to end with this last question before the little game I want to play at the end. And once again, thank you, Mark, again for doing this. Since '98, when Carl passed away, unfortunately, both Brian and now within the last handful of years or so with Alan, Blondie, as well as Mike with Bruce and his group, have consistently been touring minus any health setbacks since then. What's it been like for you, not only as a fan for the music that's benefited you, but for you to be able to have an input and point of view to be able to bring this music out to the limelight all these years later?
Well, it hasn't really changed. I mean, as I said, Fuel Flows and this project, are both things that, if you'd asked me, I don't know, 5 years ago, 10, well, not 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I would have said the same thing. I mean, my reaction to the success of other projects was always, oh, we really, we should be doing this period. I mean, the 68 albums that we did, that unfortunately, are only downloads and the streaming, they're not available physically. Wake the World and I Can Hear Music, that cover Friends in 2020. I mean, that's, I'm glad we got to do them. And there's kind of an irony there, because they were sort of based around copyright needs, and ironically bootlegs. But that's another period that I would have really liked to have done a full scale box like one of these,
Sure.
because it's, I mean, this whole period, I mean, even for me personally, when because I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it, even when I started working on this material, I paid less attention to it than Pet Sounds and the stuff that I was more familiar with. But the deeper I got into it, I realized that there was this huge treasure trove of their music that most of the world, hadn't been exposed to, well, at all in
Yeah.
recent memory. But in some ways, hadn't, except for Surf's Up, maybe, hadn't really been exposed to much at all.
Sure.
Because at the time when they came out, the way history and the marketplace and all those things kind of conspired against them.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, but thankfully there are people like you and Alan out there who are helping bring this music to a whole different generation. Before we end here, I want to know this little game called All This or That, which would be a good song title for the Beach Boys to do if they ever decide to do something of that nature. And this, I'll throw out a name of something. You have to choose either this or that, if that makes sense.
Okay.
It's all Beach Boys related. First one, Call My Passion So Tough, or Holland.
So I would have given you a different answer before I did this project. I probably would have said Holland, but now I'm not so sure. If I were doing it, I would, the best of both albums. I've got favorites on both of them, and part of that, frankly, is because we dissected some of these things. I think these are both albums where dissections really, if you're a music fan, really tell you a lot.
The next one, MIU or the LA Light album?
See, again, that's tough because there's really good stuff on both of them,
Yeah.
and there's some weaker tracks on them. But this is, of course, always the problem. It just can be the problem when you get into albums as opposed to singles.
Yeah.
And part of that for me is just that, my taste went somewhere else when those records were current.
Right.
And if we're ever able to really do something serious with those, with those albums, at 15 Big Ones, and even, all the unreleased stuff. I mean, not Landlocked, sorry, Adult Child, that whole period.
Yeah.
You know, the more I get to work on something or really work with it, the more appreciation I gain for what they were up to in that period. I mean, I have to admit that, you know, those albums, you know, passed me by. If I looked at the release dates, I could tell you. I mean, you know, I was just listening to different, you know, to different things. I was listening to
Sure.
Frank Zappa, who I ultimately went to work for,
Yeah.
and a lot of prog rock. And it's interesting to go back. You know, if I go back now on a sort of nostalgia trip and listen to some of that stuff, some of it I still like an awful lot, and some of it I'm like, you know,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah.
I guess, you know, I guess in those days the drugs made up for it, maybe.
Sure.
But uh, you know, we all have um, our musical history,
Sure.
even as listeners.
Well, I in that situation, I'll only say LA Light album because Dennis's material on there that it comes from his solo albums saves the album for me, and of course the Carl Wilson Brian Wilson the songwriting duo that put together Good Time and was saves it for me as well on that album.
Yeah, I mean they're both good. You know, they're both good albums, and they both have great stuff on them. It's just you know, the albums just even in this period. I mean, they start. You know, it's like the Beatles. They start to be more like solo. You
Sure.
know,
Yeah.
solo records with Beach Boys on them or
Yeah.
not. You know, and so that sort of changes you know, the way you look at them, especially for a group that was, you know, so much about, you know, being a group sound as opposed to you know, any individual members.
Sure. Now, this will be the last one of the albums that I'll do. Keeping the Summer Alive or the self-titled 1985 album.
I'll reserve judgment on that. I mean, part of the problem with those records is that the production um, you know, tends to get in the way
Sure.
a bit, and it's less true, for example, like on Brian's first solo album that I worked on a lot.
Sure.
But even there, and I'm as guilty of this. I mean, I didn't choose those things, but you
Yeah.
know, but you know, a lot of records I worked on in that period, you know, as with today,
Sure.
they tended to go for a certain production value that I'm not sure in retrospect was the best way to present the songs. I mean, for example, I keep the song "Keeping the Summer Alive." I think the live version from Nebworth is better
Yeah.
than, you know, better than the studio version. Um, and whether that's just because it's more exciting live or what. But when you get away, for me, when you get away from that organic, you know, the organic
Sure.
recording and into machines, it's tough. I mean, it's better now. In some ways, it's better now. I mean, it's less obvious, if you will.
Sure.
But I have a lot of problems with a lot of current music, and I work on a lot of it. I mean,
Sure.
I do a lot of broadcast music, and you know, the purity of musicians playing and people singing, and you know, back when we didn't have all these other ways of doing it and these fancy gadgets. Again, maybe I'm just an old guy, but it's always more appealing to me, and I'm always pleased when somebody today comes along and seems to have that same sensibility.
Sure. This next one, I'll do this in more of a different avenue. Gary Usher or Roger Christian?
I'd have to look at the song titles. I want off the top of my head, I would say Roger, but that's probably because Gary, you know, did a lot. Well, yeah, it's kind of hard to say, but Gary,
Yeah.
you know, Gary did an awful lot of stuff that was, you know, just you know, let's make another surf themed album this
Sure.
afternoon, you know, and they're kind of fun, you know,
Yeah.
Dracula's Deuce or, you know, whatever it was.
Yeah.
It You know, so it's hard if you just ask me about them as writers and produce. Well, Roger wasn't a producer, but I tend to fall back on the overall output, not just
Sure.
the Beach Boys.
Well, what I like about Gary is that he worked with, I believe, and you probably know this to be certain, he worked with Brian a bit on his first solo album in the late 80s. And there's a song on that album, I believe it's Being with the One You Love, that was on that album that Brian had performed, that I thought was, pretty good, especially the version that was previously before it turned into that one. But that's a whole nother conversation for a whole another day.
Became Doing Time on Planet Earth, but I think
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
if I were to guess without
Yeah.
doing the research, that's probably the Dr. Eugene Landy's
Yeah.
lyrics.
Yeah.
And we have a few of those.
Yes. But
Yeah,
I like the
it's
finished
interesting
version
too. I
though.
mean, there's a whole set of Gary Usher demos with Brian, and they're demos, so you don't you excuse it. It's drum machines, and
Yeah.
but it does make it a little harder to relate to the songs. Whereas in the '60s, demos are a stripped down band maybe, but they're much closer to what the records became, and much easier to envision than in the '80s when it's let's make a drum beat and with a machine and
Sure.
sing over it and we're done.
The final one, I want to say this, and we sort of talked about one of those guys when we first spoke in June of this past summer. Chuck Britz or Steven Desper?
It's two completely different things. I'd be loath to have to pick, because one, Chuck was dealing with much more of all the elements are, I got 16 guys in the room, and I won't say it was more about capturing a performance, whereas for Steve it was much more like building a performance that they were creating. So I can't really pick either one, because they were sort of different, dealing with different eras. And it's interesting though, I once asked, one of the times I spoke to Chuck, because when I found out that he had, towards the end of his life, he was working in the tape transfer room at Hanna-Barbera, the cartoon makers out here. And I asked him why he had, gotten out of making records relatively early in life. And his reply was, quote, "Mark, I couldn't stand all that overdubbing." And I know what he means. Unfortunately, live stuff is one thing, but I have not done too many records that would fit into the category of how they made records, in Chuck's day. Last one would have been, I did a Broadway cast album about, God, I don't know what it is now, 10 years ago or something, in New York. And it was just fantastic because we had the pit band. And so the whole thing is just, coming at you, balanced right, and are relatively right, and even that was more elaborate than what would have been coming out of Studio 3, back in the day. And I know what Chuck means. If what you were used to was, going in at 11 o'clock at night and at 2 or whatever it was, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, you've got the finished track of God Only Knows, and you're never going to add another anything except vocals, as opposed to, okay, now come a couple of years later, and now we're going to cut a basic track with drums and bass and guitar, and we kind of want them isolated, so the room, the room sound, if anything, is a detriment. And then, as when I started, it was not uncommon, you'd spend all day doing, 2 guitar solos on a song, or you'd spend weeks doing vocals and comping vocals and all that. It was fine. I was happy to, just be in the room, but I can certainly understand if you, as Chuck did, spent 10, 15, 20 years, capturing these amazing performances, on the spot. It would be hard to do that. The irony, of course, is that the kind of things I'm talking about that bugged him was when engineers, made a lot more money because there was a lot more work, and studios made more money. Because no, we're not going to, cut 3 tracks this afternoon and come in tomorrow and maybe spend 2 or 3 days doing the vocals, and mix it the day after, and boom, it's all done. We're gonna we're gonna sit here for a week and do bass overdubs or something. So yeah, I understand his perspective on that. That it just, I mean, I didn't understand it. I mean, I didn't really understand what he was saying at the time, and I wish I had, because I'd love to talk to him about it. And there are a few guys out there that I guess you could still ask that question. It's sort of, I can tell you sort of an interesting story that's sort of related to that. When I worked at Warner Studios in the 80s, my boss was Lee Hirschberg, and Lee, did a lot, ridiculous amount of pop records, mostly for Lenny Waronker and Russ Titleman and people like that. But his big start was as Frank Sinatra's engineer, beginning with Strangers in the Night, and except for the duets album towards the end of Frank's life, he did pretty much everything. And in those records, I have a lot of the outtakes from that. Those records are just amazing, because it's live, live big band on the floor and Frank singing live, and overdubbing he hated overdubbing. He just didn't like it, didn't want to do it. And one of the things I did when I was getting into building my studio was, I guess, well, in part because of my love of all these old records, I was able to buy a couple of the original consoles that had been at United Western, and used them for all kinds of stuff. The remix of Pet Sounds and Brian sold records, and on and on and on. And 20 years ago, my wife threw me a 50th birthday party, and Lee came, and I thought, oh well, I'll show him, I'll show him the console I have, and if you showed me something that I worked on in the beginning, I'd be kind of warm and fuzzy about it. And he was kind of horrified that anybody would want anything to do with that. Now, this is more of a technical thing, and we talked about it for a while, and I realized what it was is that however good it sounded, the damn things were just so unreliable that it was more like piloting the Titanic. Because you'd be the guy who had to, when the console one module started making noise and you couldn't record, you had to be the guy who say, Frank, we gotta, you and the 40 musicians out there got to take a break while we try to fix this.
You don't want to be doing that.
No. So it did help explain this. There's a whole other level to this, that when all that old gear, went out, how much difference did it make when the solid state gear came in, which I agree, probably, at least initially, did not sound as good, but it didn't matter, because it was reliable.
Sure.
And it's funny that what would it be now? 40 years ago, the only place you found all that old tube gear was either in a junk store or in the 2-bit studios here in town. I mean, when I started out here in like 72, 73, I worked at a really crummy studio, and they, like a lot of crummy studios, had all the old tube mics that nobody wanted, that are now worth $20,000-$30,000.
Wow.
That whole studio probably didn't have much more than or maybe no, probably didn't have that much, spent on gear in the whole damn place. So it's it's interesting how these things happen.
Well, it's just that's why that music from the period that when you grew up, and the music that I've been able to tune into now that you've had a role in putting out there for people, and a new limelight and a new degree is such a beautiful thing compared to a lot of the music nowadays that's on TikTok and all that stuff that's sort of come to fruition. But that's another conversation for another day. Well, sir, again, this is a blast, and I appreciate and time you took to come on again to talk about this amazing box set, Sail on Sailor, which is out now as of this recording. It's been out for about the past week. Mark, where can people get it? Amazon, those sort of places?
It's available everywhere. I mean, Amazon and well, I mean, as the physical, yeah, the physical product, of course.
Yeah,
And it's on all the streaming platforms.
sure.
And I haven't looked. I assume a good bit of it's on YouTube.
Yeah,
Um,
probably.
and we, you know, and frankly, we haven't touched on a number of things. I mean, for example, "Carry Me Home," the Dennis Wilson
Yeah, yeah.
track that was originally slated for Surf's Up, um, but was considered, and I can sort of understand this, a bit too dark. You
Yeah.
know, even for the newly socially conscious Beach Boys, and it's taken, you know, it, that carried over. I mean, we've tried to release it a number of times on compilations, and it's just never been something that the group was comfortable with.
Well, everyone out there, if you're listening to us reviewing this, why the heck not? I heavily encourage you, as well as Mark, I'm sure does, to check it out, buy the hard copy or the version online, or both, whatever suits your heart. Check it out there. You won't be disappointed. Follow on social media, Twitter, Nolan Current Night Show, Instagram, Nolan Current Night Show. And in the words of Johnny Carson, the dean of shows like this, although his is vastly better than mine, I bid you all a heartfelt good night. Take care until next time.